Recording in progress.
Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Miriam Hester will defend the academic thesis, Challenges, Pitfalls and Opportunities, Workplace Learning during Healthcare Placement Abroad, an International Perspective on Clinical Training in Health Professions Education. May I invite you to present a summary of your thesis and the conclusions of your study.
Thank you, Professor. Dear audience, it's been almost 30 years ago that I boarded a plane to Costa Rica. After my graduation as a physiotherapist, I had decided to go for a voluntary job abroad. I prepared for the year, and apart from the language and cultural differences, I had not realized that there would also be educational and professional challenges to perform my work elsewhere. It sparked an interest, however, which many years later has resulted in this research that I will share with you today. My name is Miriam Hester, and I will walk you through my PhD research following the different chapters of my thesis. The aim of my research is to increase understanding of the needs and the support for healthcare students during workplace learning in an international context, particularly during the initiation of placement. I will use the rich pictures that I collected during my final studies to tell my story. To begin with, I have studied physiotherapy and exercise therapy student at the Faculty of Health within the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Their internships take between 10 to 20 weeks of practice and are generally supervised one-on-one, as you can see in this drawing above me. I've explored student experiences of international placements in a diversity of healthcare settings worldwide, such as private practices, hospitals, and rehabilitation centers. And I've used several qualitative research methods to do so, such as interviews, collecting audio diaries, and rich pictures. Research shows that healthcare students learn by doing. In other words, they need to engage in patient and team-related activities to develop their knowledge, skills, and attitude. Student participation may be challenged when going abroad, since they can encounter language barriers, cultural differences, and unfamiliar educational practices. These differences may keep students away from practicing, since they can feel uncomfortable about their position as a learner in the practice. From my perspective as a clinical coordinator and an educator, I'm interested to see how we can support this learning process so that the students benefit most from their international experience. On the picture, you see a student walking with a patient in Cape Town with the Table Mountain in the backdrop. In my first study, I have looked at initiation of workplace learning. Students travel, they leave their country of training to find that they often need to realign their expectations and learning goals to local practices. Through participation in practice, they become more comfortable to find the right level of engagement, and that can be supported by peers and supervisors. Once the process of orientation and adjustment is completed, students become legitimate participants in practice, and they start to contribute to care in a more meaningful way. The step will allow them to become part of the local community of practice and create a sense of belonging. I found that students adapted their goals depending on the phase of initiation. In my second study, I have explored the initiation phase in more detail by collecting audio diaries during the first month of student placement abroad. Students explained what they observed, whom they collaborated with, and what their struggles were. This resulted in three main themes, the first of which being the professional context. Working in a different healthcare system would trigger questions such as, I really cannot understand the system here, I can't cope with it. I also don't think the patients don't care about their bodies and how they feel, like they're just going to do exercise with us. A second theme related to the differences in educational context. Students would compare their knowledge and their skills with those of local peers who help them to negotiate the differences in practice, such as having the opportunity to watch an exam of another student and then seeing a lot of differences, but also similarities to the school system that they're trained in. The third theme from this study described the approaches to individual learning. And it showed that time to reflect on learning goals helped students to build confidence to try out new things and to develop an individual approach to care based on differences observed. They said that they are, for example, really lucky with the placement because they are already autonomous, where in the Netherlands they would not have been, and they've experienced trust and putting theory into practice. Then in the next study, I've used a critical incident theory to ask students after important events that impacted on their participation in practice. The events could either be large or small, personal or professional. Based on the student accounts, I have found that not only workplace-related events played a role, yet also student well-being often seemed compromised in favor of passing their internship. For example, Intercultural challenges in patient approach, so for example, how to greet a patient or how to end a treatment. Language barriers, reason as to why you could not engage in a conversation with colleagues during lunch, or inappropriate behavior, which is based on stereotyping. Students would purposefully use their support network in the clinical workplace, as well as their friends and family, to overcome such challenges, but hardly ever involved the academic network, because they felt it was out of reach or either too far away for the problem being solved short time. In my fourth and final study, therefore, I have asked students to draw from these experiences abroad and reflect on how personal and professional challenges impacted on workplace learning during placement abroad. They described learning to work in an international context and how cultural differences shaped their professional identity, because they learned from different approaches to patient care, to illness and health. How students created deliberate social connections in the workplace, but also abroad, in order to stimulate well-being and to make most of learning. And eventually, they accounted of personal growth. Some of the experiences were impacting well-being beyond clinical walls or the educational system. So I have learned that local healthcare teams can support students' workplace learning by engaging them in patient and team-related activities directly from the start of placement. Most importantly, there should be room to engage in professional dialogue with the local healthcare staff about differences observed in practice, since this will create new and relevant learning opportunities. A peer buddy system might be helpful to smoothen the transition into international placements, as does establishing an adequate support network. Educational programs, therefore, should ensure that student support before, during, and after international placements can be guaranteed. The personal and professional experiences are certainly worth the effort. And for me, I will go back to Costa Rica this summer, not only to introduce my former colleagues to my family and enjoy the country from a tourist perspective. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Joosten ten Brinke, Professor Learning and Assessment at the Maastricht University. Professor Joosten ten Brinke was also the chair of the assessment committee.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, I thoroughly enjoyed reading your dissertation. It is well structured, and I found the various methodologies you used very interesting. The rich images and audio diaries in particular are not often used, but provide valuable insights. All chapters are published articles, which deserves a big compliment also for your supervising team. However, I'm not here for the compliments today, but rather to take this opportunity to ask you some questions about your dissertation. My first question actually relates to your entire thesis. Support is mentioned very often throughout your thesis, and you indicate that this is very important in these international placements. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 focus on the research question that is central to that support. What support systems help students deal with perceived challenges to workplace learning? Support can be provided in many different ways, but an important form of support is feedback. And last week and last year at the AMI, last week at the NVMO, we had a very nice workshop on feedback processes. So I looked in your thesis to see what these feedback processes would or should look like in the context of the international placements. Unfortunately, I found that the word feedback only appears 3 times in your entire thesis, and support about 200 times. However, it does appear once in a very important context. In your reflection, in your impact paragraph, you say, feedback-seeking behavior may be hindered by intercultural differences, language and communication barriers, or even inappropriate behavior. But Then I was already on page 128 of your dissertation. My question is therefore, since you mention feedback and feedback seeking in the impact paragraph, is this something you realized yourself at the end of your research, or are the feedback processes in this context of secondary importance?
Highly esteemed opponent. It's certainly a field that deserves attention. However, it's not been part of my thesis. So I have left the feedback processes out of the scope of studies, because initially we set out to study the challenges perceived by students, and we had not realized that the support network played such an important role. So the thesis evolving, we found that the network actually played an important part, but I have not looked into the feedback processes underlying. I do, however, realize, and that's perhaps why it turned up so late in my thesis writing, that the feedback-seeking procedures and the feedback that the students receive is part of that support, and it does play a role. But yes, that would cost me another thesis, perhaps, to embed here. Yeah.
Okay, and you mentioned feedback-seeking behavior in the impact paragraph. In the thesis, you mention support-seeking behavior. Mm-hmm. Where do you see the connection between those two? Is there a connection, and what would be a next research question in this context?
Yeah, so I do think there's a connection. However, I think within the scope of my thesis, the feedback seeking would be mainly within the clinical practice. And I think when you have a close look at the support network that we describe, it goes beyond the clinical walls. So students seek help with friends, family, that is outside, because the scope of the challenges they perceived was not only within the workplace, but also outside. So I do believe that feedback-seeking behavior within the clinic could be part of the next studies, but the support network is much broader than that.
Yeah, and so I understand that. So it's more the system and who is involved. But all those people, also parents and partners, are possible people to have the conversation with them and to ask them feedback on your behavior, but also how to perform in this new culture, and to overcome those the challenges that you mentioned in your feedback of in your research. And I was looking at your model, and I thought you have that 4-stage model, and so the support seeking, you did mention that, but is this feedback of the support seeking then more in general? How is that? How does it differ within those 4 phases? And when is for example, so what participants are the most important? What stakeholders are the most important for the students in that support-seeking process? Yeah,
so from what I've heard from the students within the initiation phase, in the first steps, they'll basically address the basic needs, the workplace conditions. So it's much of the logistics that come into play. Where do you get your name tag? Where do you hang your code? Who to address? How's the hierarchy in the workplace structure? Then they start practicing once the expectations are aligned and the goals are clearer. They'll start participating in partial tasks until they become more embedded in the care and more meaningfully engaged. And so there you see that it will counter, and the feedback seeking perhaps will also shift more towards the clinical instructor and the team, because it relates much more to the care provision, and no longer to the logistics and the conditions for workplace learning, let's say. And finally, when they become part of the healthcare team and find a sense of belonging, they'll be more open, I would expect, to receiving feedback and to proactively looking for feedback. But again, we have not studied the feedback processes in detail, but that would be my expectation.
Okay, thank you. And so I like that model, the four-phase model of healthcare students, of international clinical placements. I liked the scaffolding within that really. But I was wondering, in your PhD process, I was wondering if you could also apply this model to yourself, to you as a starting PhD in your first year.
Yeah, I definitely see this model being, having overlap with different contexts. So to me as a PhD, of course, there were like workplace conditions at the start of my PhD trajectory. So what are the rules? What are the regulations you start your PhD by? What's the field, the playground? And then once you get more familiar to what is expected of you, you start participating more and you'll grow to become more independent. And now that I'm towards the end of my PhD, I certainly would feel I have a sense of belonging, to be honest. But that took me several years, and I hope my interns will be a bit quicker than that.
Okay, and how will you help them?
By making sure that they are aware of what is expected, that they know where to go to, and that the right support is in place, so that they know that they can actually, go back and forth, to find their ways.
And then it will be possible in the shorter period.
I think my thesis shows that students do need some time to adjust into a new and familiar environment, whether it's a new job or a PhD or your internship. So the first week or two, you'll have to have time to orient yourself and to find your feet, as we call it. But then afterwards, certainly, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will keep it to that. Mr. Prorector, thank you. Give the word to you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor De Vos, Professor Education and Training at the Amsterdam University. Professor De Vos was member of the Assessment Committee, and we highly appreciate your participation to this academic ceremony.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, as my compliments with your nice scientific work. I've read it with pleasure. I've seen the start of it, and it's now time to pick the flowers, I would say. Excellent design, international flowers, international plants, and congratulations to the thesis team, and you all together have made a nice work. It's all about experiences in internships, and implicitly the thesis mentions that international internships are like a deep dive and learning students to swim, and in a reasonable, hard way. And along the way, they need support, and probably that is a good idea. Otherwise, you drown. And but explicitly, your thesis is about experiential learning and about social-cultural aspects of learning. That's the explicit way. And I have a number of questions about the didactic theories you use, or rather don't use, in your thesis, or at least don't mention. My first question is about the four-phase model. It's a nice model, and I wonder whether it's a natural model, or is it a model which is a consequence of how these internships are organized, and the model is not independent by the context in which internships are organized, and can that model not be expected by the way we have developed these internships?
Highly esteemed opponents, I wonder whether it is so much context dependent, the model, because I do see there's a lot of overlap with other contexts, as I said before. The model of the first chapter, however, we have modified in chapter 3 in the second study, because we found that the orientation adjustment phase is actually more of has a more cyclical nature, rather than stepping up. And I think what the model shows is that if we send our students into a healthcare placement, whether that's in a hospital or elsewhere, and we rotate them through different wards, for example, they might go back and forth across the model. So they might orient themselves in the first department they come into and then adjust themselves, but by the time they can start contributing, when they rotate, they fall back and need to reorientate with different supervisors, for example. The second study we have conducted showed that the orientation adjustment is mainly based on the professional dialogue. So if you can ensure a continuous dialogue in the clinical workplace, it's a much smoother process, and then the transition will also most likely be a little more fluid rather than stepping up the stairs, let's say. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah. And if I understood you well, your statement is that it is an independent model, independent from how these international internships are organized by the locals who certainly have thought about an initiation phase and how to let these students run through the process.
Yeah, so the model is based on a previous model by Sheehan et al., who studied the initiation phase in hospitals in medical students as a prerequisite for workplace learning, and she described in her model the initiation as a prerequisite for the maintenance phase where the actual learning takes place. Now, it's not defined, so therefore we have tried to zoom in on that phase. And we felt that what worked for the medical students was also working, in our case, with the physio and exercise therapy students.
Thank you. I'm satisfied about this question. I have another question for you. The next chapter is about pitfalls and hurdles, and how to deal with these things in the initiation phase. And the conclusion is keeping open communication with your teachers about expectations. And that seems a finding. However, is that open communication not what I would call a sort of scaffolding? What we do, giving feedback, reflection, working on the next phase of personal development? And how different is that from what can be expected from experiential or social cultural learning?
I do think there's overlap there, and of course scaffolding is part of it, but what we saw is that basically the students that I talked to have observed a lot of differences in local practices, and whether those were small patient-related differences in approach to health or illness, or the way that a physiotherapist would apply a certain intervention. The moment that they could openly discuss and communicate about those differences, they created new learning opportunities. And so those are not necessarily part of the scaffolding procedures that we know, the processes as described in literature. But I do think that the international context, therefore, offers a lot richer learning opportunities that we may not be aware of even. So if the student notices something and doesn't address it, the educator probably won't notice because it's their comfortable state, it's their habitat. And you would miss opportunities in practice.
Okay. I thought you would answer scaffolding is about supporting knowledge, and what you researched was a sort of moral or social support. Is there a difference between that scaffolding and the support you have looked for?
I would also think that scaffolding has to do with role modeling. So from a social perspective, I would very much look to my supervisors at the time, and maybe now in my PhD, as to how I would like to behave, or how I would like to develop, not only knowledge-wise, but also in how they approach things, how the skills apply.
Yeah, how one would develop socially.
Yes.
Okay. I would like to challenge you with a mental experience. You have a research project which builds from bottom up. You have a number of thorough questions, and you build up and have findings and worked your way through, but all within the lens of experiential and social cultural learning. What would have happened if you would have taken a top-down standpoint, making experiential learning and social cultural learning a normative model? It should be done like this. And if you would have looked in doing your research from top-down into these internships, would that have delivered different types of data and different conclusions?
I would almost say, of course it would have.
And how?
Because I think what I've tried to do is highlight not only the positive sides, but also the challenges and the pitfalls. And I think the students have shown quite a broad scope of experiences that they perceived influential on learning. If we were to follow how it should be, I think we would miss out on the details maybe, and we would end up with, I'm afraid to say, a lot of things that we would maybe want to undo eventually, but also most likely maybe not hear from students because they're too harsh or too personal or too. So I wonder if at all I would have been able to distract all the data.
It would have delivered something different.
Yes.
But also things would be lost along the road.
That's what I would expect, yes.
I'm satisfied with this answer, and I give the word back to the co-rector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Oudkerk Paul, educational consultant and researcher at the Fontys University of Applied Sciences.
Thank you. Dear candidate, first of all, my congratulations to you and also to your supervisory team for this wonderful thesis. I think it's great to see that your work really addresses maybe our most important assignment as universities of applied sciences, to prepare our students for working in a complex world often, but also really not losing sight of their well-being, which is, I think, really important. I also read your study, having a job, a function as an educationalist at a University of Applied Sciences, mainly in the economic domain. And this is where I started to think that we also work with internships, often abroad. But the reality of students doing internships in the economical field is really different from if you look at healthcare educational programs. So we do have contact with the companies, but we don't have any really formal requirements or a program on what this internship should look like, specific activities, specifying learning goals, also maybe some training for the supervisors. So you could say we have a bit less of control, influence as a university on what the students will actually experience when they're in an internship, specifically abroad. Mm-hmm. So thinking about this, my first question is to you, given the explanation of our context, is: do you think, or to what extent do you think that your findings and your results are transferable to this educational context within the economic fields? Could you elaborate on that?
Esteemed opponent, I can, for sure. I think what is important to learn from my thesis research is that you see that when we send our students abroad, whatever their purpose of education, they will encounter challenges based on language, based on education, on cultural differences, and on well-being, on sense of belonging, let's say. I also feel that as an educator, we don't address those challenges often. we forget about it because we tend to focus on what we want them to learn at school, at the university. So we do reflect on their learning outcomes. We do reflect on their experiences related to the field of internship, but we don't ask much after personal experiences, personal dilemmas, somewhat after ethical dilemmas concerning literature, health and safety, but that's it. So, and I think, having spoken with many students, when you lose a relative, but you're abroad for internship, and can you fly home to attend the funeral? Can you, for example, fly home if your mom falls ill and you want to just be with them? Or will you stick to the internship and complete things regardless of anything, because you have made that effort preparing and paying and finding accommodation, everything, to go there in order to learn and to grow and to follow your study. There might be delay for you if you do decide differently. And I think those elements, regardless of the context, apply to all studies. So yes, there are elements, and I think as educators we should also be aware of the fact that we don't only send them abroad to learn whatever it is we want them to learn, but there's so many other factors on the interplay with that experience, and we should address those more.
Mm-hmm. And in your thesis, you also often you emphasize the importance of indeed being seen, but also having good guidance, having someone to talk to who also knows a bit more about, actually, let's say the goals and maybe the required activities. Do you see maybe a challenge there in the fact that we don't really have such formal agreements?
So what I've learned from our students is also that they find ways beyond educational paths to find each other as peers, to set up a support network, for example, within close reach of the placement that they are in. So either with local peers or with peers that are in the same region, or they find digital means to contact each other and to ventilate and to do that. So I think there's a lot more that happens beyond our reach in the informal level, on the informal level, let's say. If we want to structure, I do think that we would have more opportunity to create better learning outcomes, perhaps.
Yeah, so maybe to follow up on that. So next year we are starting with a newly designed curriculum, as often happens in education. So now there's also a chance for us, an opportunity. So based on your experience in the past years, what would your top tip or recommendation be for us as our educational program within the economic field? What should we definitely do, given the limitations we have?
Yeah, so certainly make sure that there is reflection time embedded as part of the program. So that reflection time is effectuated either during or after the placement, and that they can find peers, either a buddy system or, if possible locally, but if not, peers from the same educational program, to learn with and from. Those two are the main concerns, I'd say.
Thank you. So you mentioned reflection time, and I also have maybe a bit more practical question. So what I really enjoyed while reading your thesis was that you use a great variety of research methods, such as the audio diaries, but also the rich picture drawing. And these seem to stimulate students to really have enable them to describe a really rich learning experience. And I think often when we think about how we guide students, but also how we assess them, we ask them to indeed write a reflexive report or a logbook or something, write something down in their portfolio, which is very dependent on them being good writers, you could say. So I was thinking, could your research methods be maybe an option we could use in the way we guide students, but also assess students, and enabling them to share their experience and their development? What would you agree, and what could this look like, do you think?
Yeah, you could For example, the audio diaries was a very effective way of having students feel free and comfortable to speak. They used their own smartphones and they could choose the moment that they wanted to ventilate based on a structured prompt sheet. So what I asked them to is that they had to hand in 2 entries a week, but they could pick their moment and it could be as lengthy or as short as they would want to, but it should revolve around the same questions. And I think that's a perfect way of having students, being able and feel free to speak about their experiences because it's firsthand. But it would mean that you as an educator would have to have time to listen to all those. I had 96 hours of audio material, and that's a lot, and it was just, I don't know, 15 students or so. So the thing is, yes, of course you can, but maybe in a peer group or maybe in other ways, or have excerpts from audio data. I wouldn't recommend the rich picture drawing, however, it was fun, but not for students, I think, as a reflection method. And interviews, maybe interviewing one another about experiences could work. Yeah.
Thank you. Great ideas. One last question, I think, with a short answer. It's maybe more also on the policy side, but if you look at internationalization, it's of course a hot topic also in our current political environment, you could say. So I'm not asking you for a political stance, but we have a lot of discussions about the language we should use within our universities, also student numbers, students coming from abroad. If you would have the opportunity to talk with the Minister of Education and Science and Culture, what are the insights? What would you want would be your message, given your experience working on this thesis?
That's an interesting question. I was, and I'm still very much in favor of international experiences. And I think what they do is they enrich you not only as a professional, but also as a person. They'll give you opportunity to look beyond your own zone of comfort, beyond your own perspective as a professional, and to actually engage in different approaches, so different perspectives, and mainly like the whole diversity inclusion discussion we have within the university, it taps into this, right? So it's bringing new perspectives home and integrating them into your own individual approach. And I think, the flowers maybe show the richness of colors coming together, working together. I would definitely ask to keep the international component of the programs in education. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm satisfied with the answers. Give the word to the prorector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Brouwer, Director of She Collaborates. Dr. Brouwer was also a member of the assessment committee.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, I would like to join the other opponents in congratulating you and your dream team on achieving this massive milestone, or on reaching this landmark in Globetrotters terms. It's been a pleasure to travel this PhD journey together for a large part, and it's an honor to now be here today to welcome you at the arrivals sign. But not before we enjoy sharing and exchanging some further views, as I too prepare some questions for today. The first one follows up, I think, nicely on Dr. Oudkerk-Pol's ones. In chapter 3, you briefly addressed the curriculum setup at ESP, and you described that only one placement may be conducted in the Netherlands to ensure globally competent practitioners. And I wonder how you can define what a globally competent practitioner is, and how would you know if a graduate is ready to practice across borders, and how international placements contribute to that transition?
Esteemed opponent, the term globally competent practitioner is a tricky one, I would say. So our students, they are trained in the Netherlands from the International School of Physiotherapy, and they conduct one placement in the Netherlands to learn from the local healthcare system. And often they go to their home countries, however, not always. But we want them to compare different perspectives, different healthcare systems. So to look for overlap, similarities, to have a broader view on their profession. And I think what I mean with the global competent professional is that they would be adaptive to other systems, so they would not hesitate to embed themselves in another culture, whether that's educational or professional, and engage and learn from the opportunities that arise, and to mix with different people from different backgrounds, cultures. Not being institutionally trained only in the Netherlands, following that path, following the guidelines for practice only within that country, but being more flexible, more adaptable, and therefore better prepared, I think, to the challenges that the profession might offer.
Thank you. When I compared the reflexivity paragraphs in the different chapters, I noticed a shift in tone. I think it was between chapter 4 and 5, where first you describe you and your team's positive stance towards globalization of healthcare. Mm-hmm. And then in the next chapter, you express a more critical stance, specifically towards short-term placements and their ability to offer meaningful learning experiences.
Yes.
I think we both agree that globalization entails a lot more than short-term placements. But I wondered if you want to elaborate on what these different stances represent in your journey of reflection. And do these wordings reflect a transformation in your thinking, or should I explain that differently?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if it's a transformation in my thinking. I think it's with, how do we say that, increased insights from the research. So what happened is, when we studied the initiation phase, I noticed that students do need time to orientate and adjust, and that often was limited to a week, maximally 2 weeks, before they felt more comfortable, let's say comfortable enough to actually engage in practice. What you see in the medical field is that sometimes students are on an exchange or a placement for only between 1 to 4 weeks. But then if you lose 2 weeks in adjusting into a new clinical learning environment, what is left? Is that worth it, yes or no? So I do think that we as educators should carefully consider the goals and the aims with which we send our students abroad, and whether it merits a short-term placement or we should go for the longer-term placements, because there's enough time to actually dive into that learning, to take the deep dive, as the opponent said. So, and I think that overall, looking back at the thesis, that would be an element of research that I would also like to further explore, the short time or the duration of the placements in the medical field and in the allied healthcare, and the consequences of the duration for that, yes.
So this is more about the implementation of globalization, or the approaches or the methods, while you stay with your positive stance regarding globalization of healthcare.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a bit what you mean with that positive stance?
So all team members have either experience working abroad or collaborating in research projects abroad, and all with successful experiences, having a positive outlook towards the purpose and the contribution of international elements, let's say. So we're biased in that sense. I think all 5 of us, coming from a stance where we are interested in internationalization and we see the value, but we're still critical towards what aspects do contribute or don't contribute. Yes.
Maybe we can follow up on that a bit more. I think, as with any international travel, clinical placements abroad, and then especially in low and middle income countries, come with both opportunities as well as ethical complexities that deserve careful navigation. Mm-hmm. Your thesis and also your presentation highlights a few of these already, such as language barriers and cultural differences, especially if they limit student learning. Other concerns include the environmental impact of long-distance travel and the risk of limited benefit or even harm to local patient populations, and the lack of reciprocity or equity in institutional partnerships. I share your positive stance towards globalization, but I do sometimes struggle to do these concerns justice, for example, in our pre-departure education and our partnership policies. So what do you think that students, home and host institutions can do to ensure that these learning journeys are conducted in an ethically sound and mutual beneficial way?
I recognize the reciprocity, and I do think that one of the reasons for students to want to go abroad should be that they are not only taking something there, but they're also taking lessons from their host institution. And it should be on a more equal level. So I'm in the fortunate position that our students are oftentimes able to actually work quite equally with the local healthcare teams, what I've seen differently as well. So yes, in partnerships, it should be clear on both ends what is in the deal we're making. I saw a difference between the Dutch students going abroad versus the international students in that if it's a one-off, if it's a one-time experience, students often go with a different mindset than the students that go more often, because they tend to look to places where they can actually learn something, and they tend to be more aware of their own individual learning goals, but also clearer, therefore, in their communication between the host institution and the educational institution. So, yeah, I think it would be good for students to have multiple international experiences, whether at home or abroad, from an internationalization point of view, so that also host institutions can benefit more from what they come to do.
Benefit in terms of contribution to patient care, for example?
Benefit in terms of exchanging different perspectives and learning, like mutual learning, more on an equal level than just a student going there and to learn a skill and coming back having obtained the skill but not having left anything.
Yeah. And how does that relate to, I think it was one of the examples in your presentation where a student experienced more autonomy in the host context than he would have, or they or she, in their home context situation. So we recognize this also in our medical context, where students sometimes in international electives get more responsibility or get to do tasks that they back home would only do under strict supervision, for example, which we think is a concern. How do you view that, and how is that? How can we work with that in preparation also? Yeah,
we see the same in physiotherapy, for example, because the placements abroad are much broader, so less within the private practice settings, but more in hospitals, academic hospitals, rehab centers. Students become more autonomous. But I think it depends on the relationship between supervisor and student and the capacity of a student. So we should also attune the supervisors to what they can expect of the students coming in. So inform the host institutions clearly about the level and the goals for placement, so that they can actually provide autonomy or not, if that's a concern. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Leroy, Professor in Procedural Sedation and Analgesia in Children at this university. Professor Leroy was member of the assessment committee, and he is the secretary of this degree committee.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, congratulations for an amazing effort, also for your supervisory team, and also for the support network here on the first row. I'm very curious about their strategies of team interaction and instrumental factors they applied on you. And then together with your personal factors, I'm quite sure that the last one played a major role, but I'm very curious about your staircase that you followed in this whole journey. Thank you for an amazing piece of work. I'm supervising a lot of medical students who go abroad for their internships in Africa, mainly, and I learned a lot. This is really helpful also, I think, for teachers and supervisors in understanding what students might need. But we're here to question you. I'm probably the last, so still 10 minutes for you to go. I hope you're doing well. That's the pediatrician in me, of course, that plays a role. You mentioned already several times the many advantages that placements abroad might bring for a student. That might be quite idealistic. Couldn't we just send our students to the culturally different parts of our healthcare here in Europe, in the Netherlands, like street clinics in Rotterdam, or working with people who have problems with literacy or poverty? Mm-hmm. Why do we actually need to send students abroad to learn these specific intercultural competencies? That's my first question.
Highly esteemed opponent. They don't have to go abroad, would be my answer. Not necessarily, because they can learn intercultural competences here, for sure. And a lot, has been discussed, is about taking different perspectives, learning from different cultural or educational backgrounds, which we can do within our nowadays society. And I do think that it should be part of an educational system. But I also think that taking that deep dive into a different healthcare system allows them to contrast approaches and to contrast similarities, differences a bit more, because they are stepping out of their comfort zone and they will find themselves in an unfamiliar environment, and they need to swim. They need to somehow find a way. So if we send them to Rotterdam, let's say, where I'm not
saying that Rotterdam has a poverty problem.
I worked in
could be Maastricht, could be.
I worked in Rotterdam for years, and I lived in Amsterdam at the time, which was a cultural clash, I can tell you.
I can imagine if you go to the richest part of Amsterdam, you learn a lot as well of abnormal behavior. But it's.
I learned a lot there, but it's different than being on your own, being without a close support network, making sure that everything comes together still.
Yeah. So you believe in a kind of a spontaneous process that takes place when you put students in a really different context.
Yes.
Yeah. I hope I'm allowed to.
It may not be for all.
Yeah, of course. Do you know the work by Judith van der Kamp?
Yes.
Yeah, you have read that book.
I have.
Yeah. I hope I can read a small part in Dutch out of it, because she's very critical on placements abroad. She's not saying that it's not interesting, but that she is an anthropologist, as you know. She did her PhD on the perspective on rotations abroad, but from the local people, the local students, local healthcare professionals. And she says the following: Westerse opleidingsinstituten en vrijwilligersorganisaties beweren vaak dat je als westerling interculturele competenties opdoet door een tijdje in een ontwikkelingsland te werken. Ik heb grote moeite met die overtuiging. Interculturele competenties verwerf je namelijk niet door simpelweg in een andere cultuur te zijn. Sterker nog, de kans is groot dat westerse tropenhangers stereotype beeldvorming ermee versterken en de kloof tussen wij en zij vergroten. Je doet interculturele competenties op wanneer je als westerling tijdens een internationaal werkbezoek met een open blik om je heen kijkt, je tolerant bent voor wat er niet goed is, wanneer je leert te wachten zonder te duiden, uitstel van oordeel. Je doet er goed aan om op een gepast moment en met veel respect de lokale medewerkers te bevragen, al zul je in de tijd dat je aanwezig bent niet alles kunnen weten, laat staan begrijpen. Pas als je dat herkent, doe je interculturele competenties op. Now we switch to English again. Sorry for the people from abroad that I switched to Dutch. But how can we organize that specific part that she is mentioning? The curiosity, the openness, the flexibility, the modesty towards learning from others there. How can we foster that in our preparations, maybe selections of students going abroad?
Yeah, I think it's somehow a bit shocking, maybe, that there's a lot of factors that you now read out that are also described in my thesis. So the open-mindedness, the being able to ask questions, the reflect. These are elements that are certainly very important. I've been with the Dutch board looking into selection procedures for medical students going abroad, but I do think that we might also pass by students that are willing to, but maybe have not had the chance yet to develop such competences. So we should foster those competences maybe early in the medical programs or in the health programs by by the way that we provide our education. And I think a lot of the literature about student preparation for placement abroad or exchange is directed at health, safety, ethical questions, ethical dilemmas, but not so much about interviewing style or their own perspective or their resilience or things like that.
It seems more a matter of basic attitudes, actually, and values, like flexibility, curiosity, not judging. When I read, for example, on page 52 of your thesis, where you mention the first strategy, that's the audio tape, that's the very interesting study. You explore the strategies that students use to overcome these uncertainties. And then I read the quotes. The patients here, they don't care about their bodies. What a judgment. So apparently, a student who is in a field of uncertainty has a kind of tendency to judge the other one, and so the problem, to externalize the problem. How can we change that basic attitude instead of saying they are like this and this doctor doesn't? That we keep their mind open for learning without judging.
So one of the things we could do is take these quotes into a preparatory module, for example. And so part of what we do in the physiotherapy program is that we ask students to come and exchange their experiences about previous placements. And also address differences that are uncomfortable or uncommon, or and sometimes those are negative perspectives, which is good. I think in an ethical way, you should also address the dilemmas that you'll be looking into. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. I think what you say is just relevant for all rotations and all placements, whether they are here or there. I have a question about one of the statements. Maybe one of your paradigms can read statement number 6. The Aboriginal Australians say.
We are all visitors to this time, the place we are just passing through. Our purpose here is to observe, to learn, to grow, to love, and then we return home.
Thank you. So this is one call for flexibility and modesty. Why have you chosen this statement, and what do you mean with home, return home?
You may give a quick answer.
Thank you.
I would love that.
I strongly believe in this statement. I do feel that we're here to share experiences, and then home would be the basis where you feel safe and at home most, to me.
Thank you. Give the word back to the prorector.
Miriam Hester, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return to this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die.
On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off.
Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Miriam Hester, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense in view of its positive verdict and taken into account your previous qualifications. The degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Driessen is authorized to confirm upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Miriam Hester Wijbenga, also called the Wiep, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Wel edel zeer geleerde vrouwe Wijbenga, geachte dokter Wijbenga, highly esteemed colleague, lieve Miriam. Wat bijzonder om je op deze manier te mogen toespreken en je met recht en reden dokter te mogen noemen. Namens je hele promotieteam, Pim, Erik en Stefan, van harte gefeliciteerd met het behalen van je doctoraat. Een geweldige prestatie. En natuurlijk willen we ook je dierbaren hier in de zaal en online van harte feliciteren. Want promoveren doe je niet alleen. Je promotietraject was als een avontuurlijke vaartocht. Langs onbekende kusten, soms met een kalme zee en soms tegen de stroom in. Maar altijd met toewijding en enthousiasme. Je traject was eigenlijk ook een soort buitenlandstage voor jezelf. Een nieuwe omgeving, een nieuwe taal en heel veel te leren. Je deed tijdens deze reis talloze bestemmingen aan. In overdrachtelijke zin, daar werd al aan gerefereerd, met uiteenlopende onderzoeksmethoden en invalshoeken. En ook letterlijk, want regelmatig ontvingen wij foto's van je mobiele schrijfplek. Op Bali, aan de Costa Brava, in Kaapstad. Jij nam je proefschrift gewoon de hele wereld rond. En ik zei het al, je bent avontuurlijk, ook in je onderzoek. Je stond open voor nieuwe methoden, was nieuwsgierig naar andere perspectieven en eigenzinnig wanneer dat nodig was. En bovenal ben je trouw gebleven aan jezelf. Je bent begonnen met de Master Health Professions Education hier in Maastricht en Erik begeleidde toen je scriptie. Oorspronkelijk wilde je je, geloof ik, verdiepen in een vrij theoretisch onderwerp. En gelukkig ben je daar met wat wijze raad op tijd van afgesteld. Je reislust en je interesse in andere landen brachten je namelijk bij het huidige internationale onderwerp. Een thema dat jou echt past. Je werd een gewaardeerd lid van de Schiergemeenschap en de Leeuwengroep, waarvoor je met regelmaat afreisde naar Maastricht. En daarmee werd deze stad jouw academische thuishaven. En met een heel mooi proefschrift als resultaat. 4 gepubliceerde studies die allemaal bijdragen aan een beter begrip over hoe studenten leren tijdens een buitenlandse stage. Een belangrijk onderwerp dat veel mensen momenteel bezighoudt. Jullie zijn gedurende je promotietraject ook nog verhuisd. Het roer ging om. Weg uit hartje Amsterdam naar een nieuwe thuis aan de Waal. En dat die prachtige oude pastorie ook nog even verbouwd moest worden, ach, daar draaide jij je hand niet voor om. Jij en Rogier zijn dan ook echte aanpakkers wat dat betreft. Door deze afstand verliepen veel van onze overleggen digitaal. En daarmee kregen wij als begeleiders soms een uniek inkijkje in het thuisleven. Kinderen liepen in en uit beeld, er moest huiswerk worden nagekeken, tanden gepoetst, ruzies gesust. Ik herinner me nog een overleg waarin de hond een plant omvertrok op de achtergrond. En een andere keer dat precies tijdens een stevige discussie over je analyses de postbode met zijn auto van de dijk afgleed. Maar jij, Mirjam, bleef onverstoorbaar. Ook dat typeert je. Een scherpe focus en vasthoudendheid, ongeacht de storm om je heen. Nog zo'n voorbeeld. De coronapandemie heeft natuurlijk impact gehad op ons allemaal. Maar jij had als coördinator van de buitenlandse stages bij de European School for Physiotherapy te maken met extra uitdagingen. Terwijl studenten verspreid zaten over de wereld, nam jij meteen verantwoordelijkheid en het roer in handen. Je zorgde dat ze in contact bleven, veilig waren en waar nodig terug konden keren naar Nederland. Daaraan bleek je betrokkenheid bij je werk en je studenten. Rustig, praktisch en met oog voor wat er nodig was. Tegelijkertijd wist je ook ons als begeleiders op het juiste moment weer aan boord te hijsen. Zo trommelde je ons moeiteloos op voor een hele middag om te brainstormen over je Rich Picture studie. Dat regelde je gewoon als een ervaren stuurvrouw die weet wanneer het tijd is om de zeilen te hijsen. Vandaag vier je deze mijlpaal met de mensen die je lief hebt. En vele van hen zijn vandaag naar Maastricht afgereisd, waarvoor veel dank. Er zijn ook mensen die er vandaag helaas niet bij kunnen zijn. En we staan kort stil bij het veel te vroege overlijden van je hartsvriendin Manon en bij je broer, die momenteel ernstig ziek is en in Frankrijk woont. Je had hen er graag bij gehad op deze bijzondere dag. Want vandaag eindigt na 8,5 jaar je promotieavontuur. De haven is bereikt. En voor de mensen die met je meegevaren zijn, Boas, Isa, Olaf en Rogier en ook je ouders en alle andere vrienden om je heen, van harte gefeliciteerd met deze prachtige kersverse dokter. Mirjam, het is een fantastisch proefschrift geworden. Hier staat een apetrotse kooppromotor. En kijk, deze mannen ook. We stralen. Van harte gefeliciteerd. Goed gedaan.
Dokter Wijbenga, het is mij een genoegen om na uw promotor en co-promotor u van harte geluk te wensen met deze nieuwe onderscheiding. Namens ook de Universiteit Maastricht en namens het College van Decanen en de universiteit wenst u alle succes in uw verdere loopbaan. Hiermee sluit ik deze academische zitting. Wij gaan samen met de jonge dokter een foto maken op de trappen in de centrale hal. En dat geeft ook de gelegenheid ook om nadien uiteraard de jonge dokter geluk te wensen, maar dat zal buiten het universiteitsgebouw plaatsvinden. Hiermee sluit ik deze academische zitting.
Nee.